New Zealand, like many countries around the world, don't just have a housing crisis. We have a housing system that's been designed to produce the wrong outcomes, which is creating harm to people and to the environment. Around the world, homes are unaffordable, developments often degrade ecosystems, and many neighborhoods leave people feeling isolated rather than connected. But right now, something big is happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our government is rewriting the planning bill and the natural resources bills. These are laws that determine how every town, city, and rural community in this country develops. This is really big. For generations to come, these laws will shape whether we continue to build the same extractive development patterns or whether we start creating housing that is affordable, community-centered, and regenerative for the land. So I submitted a proposal to these two bills for the government to look over and to determine how they're going to incorporate my suggestions into these laws. Now, you also have an opportunity. Although the submission has closed, it is not too late to influence the government about what you think is the priority, how we are developing our living spaces so that we can transform the way that we live in Aotearoa. And if you are not in New Zealand, I believe that this is still very relevant because the points I mentioned in the submission are relevant for everyone, wherever, to have a greater sense of well-being and resilience in place. So I'm going to share with you the presentation that I made, and I'll make it available on the Common Ground website under the Reports and Guides section of my webpage. Reshaping Aotearoa's Planning Future. This is the submission on the Planning Bill and Natural Environment Bill, which closed in February. These are my recommendations to the government so that we can have a more resilient future. We have a rare opportunity now while these bills have not yet been written into law. The reforming of Aotearoa's planning framework and natural environment bills presents a rare opportunity to reshape how we design human settlements and secure well-being for future generations. So the reason why they've moved from the Resource Management Act, or the RMA, to these other two bills is because they wanted to improve clarity, reduce unnecessary complexity, and strengthen environmental protections. That in itself sounds good. But what is of concern is that it risks unintentionally reinforcing conventional growth-led development and resource-intensive land use and the status quo. We cannot have that continue. We already see the harm. So this is a call to action for our government and for anybody who's living in place and wants to advocate for better laws. We're going to go further to the laws need to explicitly enable regenerative land use systems, community-led models, and structural affordability. I started with my recommendation on tiny homes because in the gap of where people can afford houses or rely on social government, there is a large group of people who are stuck in the middle, and they've resorted to tiny homes because it is affordable. But we've got a lot of problems with our planning laws that they do not see this kind of house within how it fits legally. So tiny homes do deserve a legitimate place in planning. I am living in a tiny home at the moment, and I'm kind of stuck in this gap, which is why I'm starting with this as really important because I also need to be legitimate. So this is an essential housing pathway that does have minimal infrastructure demand. It is currently ambiguous in our planning laws, which means that there's inconsistency in rules and disproportionate consenting costs, creating a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty and insecurity for people seeking more affordable housing. My recommendation to the government is to establish a national definition, a fit-for-purpose standard, and permitted activity status. Luckily, there's a woman, her name is Karen Flett, who did her master's degree in exactly this. We have the research available that the government can use to create this kind of fit-for-purpose planning. You can go to Karen Flett, that's FLETT.com, to download her research and these recommendations to the government for specifically tiny home policy. The other thing we find with our rural development is that The standards are that there needs to be one house per so many acres or hectares, meaning that a lot of houses are very far apart from each other and there's large swaths of land in between. This prohibits communities being able to come together and form neighborhoods in rural areas and use the land in common. So I am now recommending that we look at cluster housing in rural areas to restore ecology and build community. So cluster housing reduces land fragmentation and preserves open space. It integrates and combines food production, shared infrastructure, and biodiversity enhancement. Win, win, win. We do have international models that we can learn from. Wales has a central government policy called One Planet Development, where rural areas can apply for the special planning rule, where these developments will showcase the best in regenerative principles and create a way that they're living as if there's only one planet Earth rather than 7 as the current Western way of living is. So the recommendation for this policy is recognize in the national planning direction and provide conservation subdivision tools for this kind of cluster housing. Or eco-villages might be another way, or co-housing or cooperative housing or agri-hoods. Those are all ways of saying this kind of clustered housing, leaving common areas. And one specific type is called the circular economy village, which is specific for economy and energy and waste and water, that it is all a circular system. This is again integrating of housing, food, renewables, shared infrastructure, and waste minimization. The model is a closed loop and community-owned and resilient-focused development. So my recommendation to government is to enable mixed-use, low-impact, integrated developments into the planning frameworks. We've heard a lot of talk about it's really a supply problem. If we just had more houses, everything would sort itself out. This is far from a supply problem. We have a housing affordability problem, which is not just going to be solved by building more. So we need a few clauses written into this law that are specifically for affordability. One of these is called inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing, which has been used to great success in Europe and in the United States. Inclusionary zoning leverages density bonuses, reduces fees to developers, and expedites the consenting process. It has been used previously as a requirement for developers in certain areas, such as in Queenstown, but I do believe taking a more voluntary approach and allowing for there to be incentives to developers who include affordability, this is the way to move forward. Cooperative housing is yet to be in the New Zealand legislation. There is a PhD researcher who did her PhD law research on exactly this. How do we put cooperative housing into our legislation? I have interviewed Sophie for the Homefulness show, so you can go and listen to that specifically to get those details. We need that written into our legislation because it's really focused on affordability, reduces speculation, and shares land efficiently. And there is the community land trust model that removes land from the speculative market to ensure permanent affordability for future generations. So my recommendation to government is recognize, give funding, and give land to community land trusts, cooperative housing, and include inclusionary zoning, and recognize that housing is a fundamental human right and write that into law. I would like to see these bills and the law move from reduction of harm to actually maximizing regeneration, whether that be in cities or rural areas. One of the things about our land use planning is that a lot of it is given over to animal agriculture, which is an actually very inefficient way to use land. We have a lot of calorie loss, we have a lot of water loss, we have a lot of polluted rivers, and a lot of these production, their export, which looks great for GDP numbers, but in the end, it is not feeding Aotearoa. We don't have cheaper food in this country because of how much land we have given over to agriculture. The agriculture is for commercial crops and for export, not serving the people of Aotearoa. What I would like to see is more plant-based land use. So we need to look from switching from industrial animal agriculture, which uses about 75% of our agricultural land. requiring high water input and biodiversity loss. You'll see that in these areas, we don't have a lot of indigenous forests, and replacing that with plant-based systems, which use about a tenth of those amount of resources. So that would be less land and water would be needed if we were growing food for humans to eat directly, those plants. That would require a dietary shift as well, people moving from a more meat-centered diet to a more plant-centered diet, which is great. We can rewild our lands, we can do carbon sequestration with all the extra land that we've got, and give ourselves ecosystem restoration. So the recommendation to government is support diversification into plant-based food and fiber industries and enable land transition pathways for farmers. So just to sum up, in the current bills as they are stated, I see 6 big risks that we can actually shift into making amendments towards a more positive focus. We have one risk is a growth-led interpretation. And as I've said, that doesn't necessarily lead to being able to feed and house Aotearoa well. And we've got, rather, we can embed ecological regeneration as our primary outcome rather than growth for growth's sake. I'm really worried that this centralized system might reduce public participation. I think we need to make sure that we maintain robust participatory mechanisms so that local governments can be responsive to communities who have housing needs that they want to respond to directly. There is a standardization which could limit innovation. We need to have a lot of innovation in the housing and land use space at the moment. So if we enable regenerative settlement overlays, we can have a lot of innovation in this space. This is focused, the current bills, on harm reduction or avoidance. Rather, let's have a focus on ecological enhancement as the explicit objectives and giving incentives for those who develop in that way. We have housing supply, which does not have tenure reform. The tenure options that we have are not meeting people's many ways that they want to live more collectively. So we need to recognize that community land trusts, cooperatives, and that housing is a human right is more leaning towards housing that is meeting housing as a place to live and grow one's family rather than as an investment and profit vehicle. And the last thing is the risk is that we entrench resource-intensive agriculture rather than let's support a plant-based and regenerative transition in our land use. So we have 2 futures, the one that the bills currently, which is keeping the status quo, or the other future. Path A is streamlining the existing paradigm, reinforcing conventional growth, resource-intensive land use, and speculative housing models. Do we really want more of what is not working? Or we can have Path B, transforming our system, catalyzing a transition towards regeneration, community agency, and ecological restoration. Wow, can you imagine living in places where you know your neighbors, you're connected, you're sharing resources, you can afford to be there without the stress of having to work all the time to pay a mortgage that you're only going to pay off when you're finally dead. We need ways of developing our communities that are human-centric and environment-centric and moving away from this growth and profit paradigm. The decisions we make in this reform to our laws will shape Aotearoa's landscapes, housing systems, ecosystems, and community for generations to come. Isn't it time that we look to a regenerative future and that we can all take a part in creating that? So I urge you to interact and engage with your ministers who represent the central government and with your local government on these better ways of thinking about housing and development. We need to embed regeneration at the core of reform. The 4 main points again are regenerative land use, structural housing affordability, ethical land stewardship, and community agency and co-design. So that's the summary of my submission to central government, and it is not too late. The government is considering, which gives us time to still have a say. So on that note, there's a few announcements that I have that lead us in that direction. I've got some opportunities and some resources. One is that I'm looking at property development for those who are community focused and who want to look at more collective housing models. There's a lot of property development courses on the market for those who've got that profit-driven motive. We don't really have anything that's available to folks who have this more collective way of doing development with affordability at the heart. So on the Common Ground website, you can look under property development course at the top under the tabs, and you will see that I'm having an expression of interest for those who would like to learn more about property development, but specifically for this community-focused design. I'm collecting interest from those who would like to take such a course. And if you are a service provider, you've already developed this kind of housing, you're an architect, you're a builder, you're a finance person, and you have wisdom to share to those who are wanting to follow in your footsteps, then maybe you could be a service provider for this course. I'm collecting interest because I don't want to put together a whole course that nobody really wants. So your expression of interest is really important to me if you want to have such a course offered. Go to this webpage, read about it, put your details in there, and I'll send you more information. The other thing that I have ongoing is the Women Revolutionizing Housing Network. We had a hui in November. A lot of women showed up with some great projects they're leading. Some of these women will be coming as mastermind for us to hear about their presentation and ask them questions and learn more about how they're doing this development. Last month, I presented on I'm a part of a development team of 2 other women, and we're looking at developing an affordable tiny home eco neighborhood. Maybe it'll be an eco village. We're not quite sure yet, but I presented our basic thinking to date. And that was nice to hear other people who want to live in such a neighborhood and what could help us to inform our design thinking. This coming one that we've got in April is a woman who's developed an app which takes people through the process of what they would wish to have with housing to help them know their pathways on how to get there. And she's done research in this area around collective housing and how people can be supported through that journey. So sign up, go under the Women Revolutionizing Housing page on the Common Ground website, and you will see a way to be added to that event series. If you are not already subscribed to the Homefulness Show, it comes onto the Common Ground YouTube channel as a playlist, and it's its own podcast show, which you can find on any podcast app. Highly recommend you subscribe so you get new episodes as they come out. I love to hear from listeners. What do you love about the shows and what kind of guests and topics interest you? The last guest was Lyndall Paris of Narara Eco Village, a fascinating story of a woman who held a dream for about 20 years of an eco village until she actually made it happen, where she is living currently with her extended family. Beautiful story, and it's really inspiring to see how she made it and brought along others with her on that journey. That's the 25th episode. You will find a lot of other episodes of value if this is the kind of topic that interests you and you want to know the nuts and bolts of how these things can be made possible. And I've got reports and guides that I have put on my website around the community land trust model and how local government and communities can create them to be able to take land out of speculation, making it available for affordable housing, and also the multicultural lens of housing. At the moment, we build houses mostly from a Western style of living, and yet many other cultures have a more collective way of doing housing. And so that report looks at how we can think more multiculturally about housing. And I'll also make my submission in the form of a document that you can download. 2 other opportunities for you is you could join the Housing Innovation Society. I sit on the committee and we're looking for new members. We will be having a coho hui in 2027. Membership provides you with a discount, but there's so many other benefits that we're going to be adding in. And it's just great to have people who want this advocacy that we are doing for collective housing. And if you want to have your say about the kind of housing that you would like to see, we need the data to drive the development. There is a New Zealand housing survey. If you look that up, you will find it. Maybe takes 10 or 15 minutes. It's really important that we have the data so that we can influence government with our advocacy around who really wants different kinds of housing. Oh, I wanted to say, in addition, talking about support, I've just opened up the Patreon page for the Homefulness Showing Common Ground. So I do all of this work pretty much without charging anyone anything. I don't get really any funding for doing this work. So the Patreon is a way for you, if you are getting any value at all, or just want to support me to continue to bring these messages and advocate for better housing and better environmental outcomes, you can support me to produce these shows and to do my work at this Patreon. So it's Homefulness and Common Ground on Patreon. I'll make that link available so that you can just click and go there for as little as $6 a month, all the way through to $48 a month, because it does take quite a bit of money to host these episodes. I'd really appreciate your support. It means a lot to me and to those who need better housing to create a better future. So thank you so much for your support